She thought she was testing him. She had no idea he was already testing her, and that the app on his phone was about to hand him a passenger neither of them was ready for. Somewhere between a borrowed car, a fake name, and a ping he never should have accepted, a billionaire was about to learn that the truth doesn't wait for a convenient exit. Nathaniel Cole had built an empire out of never being surprised. 14 years, one hotel chain into 3 continents, a boardroom voice that made executives sit up straighter. Surprise was for other people. So when his assistant, Priya, mentioned offhand that his fiancée, Isla Bennett, had been taking a lot of late Uber rides to meet a friend, Nathaniel didn't raise his voice. He filed it away, the way he filed every piece of information that didn't fit the picture, and waited for a quiet moment to decide what to do with it. The quiet moment came on a Thursday night, alone in his penthouse, staring at a phone screen that had gone dark twice while he tried to compose a text he never sent. Isla had told him she'd be at her sister's. Her location, which she didn't know he could still see from an old shared family plan app neither of them had bothered to cancel, put her 3 streets from a wine bar downtown. Not a crime. Not proof of anything. But Nathaniel had learned long ago that empires weren't lost to dramatic betrayals. They were lost to small unexplained gaps, tolerated for too long. He didn't confront her. He wasn't ready to be wrong, and he wasn't ready to be right, either. Instead, he did something that would have made his board question his sanity if they'd known. He borrowed his driver's spare car, a scuffed silver hatchback that smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee, put on a baseball cap and a jacket that had never touched a tailor, downloaded a driver account under a name that wasn't his, and set himself to accept ride requests within a 2-mile radius of the address where his fiancée said she wasn't. He told himself it was reconnaissance. He told himself a lot of things that night. The name on the account read Mike Coleman. He'd built the profile in 11 minutes, uploaded a photo where the cap shadowed most of his face, and set the car model to match. If Isla requested a ride from that wine bar back toward her apartment, there was a real chance, not a guarantee, but a real chance, that his car would be the one to answer. He wasn't thinking clearly. He would admit that later, to himself, in the specific quiet hours when a man reviews his own decisions and finds them wanting. But right then, gripping a steering wheel that didn't belong to him, driving toward a neighborhood he usually only saw from the back seat of a car someone else drove, all he could think about was the gap in her evenings and the shape of what might be filling it. The first 2 rides were nothing. An elderly man going to a pharmacy, silent and grateful. A group of university students, loud and oblivious, who tipped him in laughter and half a bag of chips left on the seat. Nathaniel drove them with the stiff, overcorrected caution of a man who had not personally operated a vehicle in 6 years, and who kept glancing at every red-lit cafe window as if his fiancée might materialize behind the glass. The third ping came in at 10:47 p.m. pickup, a bar 2 blocks from where Isla's phone had last shown her. Nathaniel's pulse, against every instinct of a man trained to appear unbothered under pressure, picked up its pace. He pulled the cap lower, checked his mirrors twice, and rolled toward the curb outside a bar called Larkspur, its windows fogged gold with warmth and laughter. The woman who climbed into the back seat was not Isla. She was taller, for one thing, with dark hair pinned up in a way that had clearly taken effort and had since started to slip, strands falling loose around a face he recognized instantly and with a jolt that ran straight down his spine like cold water. Vanessa Marchetti. 31, sharp-tongued, the kind of beautiful that photographed even better than it looked in person, and, until 4 months ago, when he told himself it was over and meant it exactly as much as men usually mean those things, his mistress. She didn't look up. She was on her phone, thumbs scrolling, heels kicked half off, the strap of her dress slipping from one shoulder. Riverside Court, she said without glancing at him, the address falling out of her mouth on autopilot, the way you give directions to a stranger you've decided isn't worth eye contact. Nathaniel's hands went still on the wheel. Riverside Court. His building. Not his penthouse, but the guest unit 2 floors below it, the one he'd put in a shell company's name 18 months ago and told himself was simply smart real estate diversification. The one where Vanessa still had a key. He should have said something. He should have pulled the car over, taken off the cap, and let the conversation happen right there on a curb outside a bar, in whatever ugly shape it wanted to take. Instead, some older, more cowardly instinct, the one that had let this entire situation exist in the first place, kept his mouth shut and his foot on the gas pedal. He pulled into traffic. The meter of the app ticked upward. And in the rearview mirror, Vanessa Marchetti kept talking, not to him, but to whoever was on the other end of her phone call, in a voice pitched low and pleased with itself, about a wedding that hadn't happened yet and a man who had absolutely no idea what she was planning to do about it. "He thinks I'm done," she said into the phone, laughing softly, the kind of laugh that had once made Nathaniel feel like the only interesting man in a room and now made the hair on his arms rise. "Please. Nathaniel Cole doesn't get to just be done with things. Not until I say he's done." Nathaniel drove 3 more blocks in silence before he trusted his own voice enough to use it. Vanessa was still talking, phone pressed to her ear, one manicured hand gesturing as though her friend on the other end could see her. "I'm not stupid," she said. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Nathaniel proposed because it looks good in a press release, not because he loves her more than he loves control. Isla Bennett is a placeholder with good bone structure. The second the wedding photos run, I go to a lawyer, and Nathaniel writes a check so large he won't even feel it, just to keep his perfect little fiancée from finding out what he's been doing in a flat 2 floors under his own penthouse. The words landed on Nathaniel like something physical, a hand flat against his sternum, pushing. He kept his eyes on the road because that was the only thing keeping his face from doing something Vanessa might notice in the mirror. Every instinct that had built him a company told him to end this cleanly, silently, the way he ended underperforming deals, cut losses, move on, minimize exposure. But there was a second voice underneath that one, quieter, angrier, that hadn't spoken up in years. It sounded a great deal like the boy he'd been before the empire, before the magazine covers, the boy who used to believe that if you built something honest, it would hold. "Big weekend planned?" he asked, pitching his voice lower and rougher than his own, an accent he practiced exactly 0 times and was now improvising badly. Vanessa glanced up, mildly annoyed at the interruption, the way people are annoyed by furniture that speaks. "Just get me there," she said, and went back to her call. "Anyway. I'm meeting him Sunday. He thinks it's about the lease renewal on the flat. It's about a lot more than the lease. Sunday. 3 days from now." Nathaniel felt the calendar in his head rearrange itself violently. He had told Isla he'd be in Geneva through the weekend for the hotel group's board retreat. He'd told his assistant to keep Sunday clear for personal errands, a phrase he'd used because he hadn't wanted to write down, even to himself, that he intended to end things with Vanessa properly, face to face, the way a person who still believed himself decent might do it. Except apparently Vanessa had plans of her own for that meeting, plans that involved lawyers and numbers with more zeros than a lease renewal required. He pulled up outside Riverside Court 11 minutes later. Vanessa slid out without looking at him twice, tossed a keep the change over her shoulder that she didn't back up with an actual tip, and walked into the lobby of his own building like she owned a piece of it, which, in the ways that mattered, she believed she nearly did. Nathaniel sat at the curb for a long time after she disappeared through the doors. The engine idled. Somewhere above him, 7 floors up, was an apartment with his name on the deed and none of his belongings in it, a monument to a decision he'd made in a moment of loneliness he could no longer fully remember the shape of. He thought about Isla, asleep or not asleep in her own apartment across the city, trusting a man who had spent the last hour discovering, by accident, in a car that wasn't his, wearing a hat that wasn't his, that his own house had a fire in it he hadn't noticed was still burning. He didn't go home that night. He drove the borrowed hatchback to an all-night diner near the docks, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a jukebox nobody used anymore, and sat with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him while he tried to reconstruct, hour by hour, the last 18 months of his life. When had it started feeling normal to keep a woman 2 floors under his own home? When had he started believing that success meant he was allowed exceptions other men weren't? He thought about the night he proposed to Isla, on the rooftop of the first hotel he'd ever built with his own money, before the empire, before the board, before any of it. She'd cried, actual tears, not the practiced kind he'd seen from other women who understood exactly what a ring like that meant for their future. Isla had looked at the ring like it embarrassed her, like she would have said yes with nothing on her finger at all, and he remembered thinking, in that specific unguarded moment, that he had finally found someone who wanted him rather than his hotels. And somewhere between that rooftop and this diner booth, he had let another woman believe she had a claim on both. His phone buzzed against the table. A text from Isla, board retreat going okay? Miss you. Can't sleep, the flat's too quiet without your snoring. Call me tomorrow. Nathaniel stared at the message until the screen dimmed and went dark on its own. He thought about the gap Priya had mentioned, the late Uber rides, the location 3 streets from a wine bar that had turned out to mean nothing at all, an innocent night with her sister that he'd twisted into suspicion because some coiled, guilty part of him had needed her to be the one at fault. He had built an entire reconnaissance operation, borrowed a car, invented a name, all because he couldn't bear the idea that the person keeping secrets might be him. He ordered a second coffee he didn't drink and began, slowly, deliberately, the way he approached every serious problem he'd ever solved, to build a plan. Not a plan to protect the wedding, or the press releases, or the version of his life that photographed well. A plan to find out exactly what Vanessa intended to do on Sunday, and to make sure that whatever storm broke over his life in the next 72 hours, Isla heard the truth from him first, in his own voice, not filtered through a lawyer's letter or a tabloid headline dressed up as concern. It was the first honest decision he'd made in 18 months, and it terrified him more than any boardroom ever had. Isla Bennett had never wanted a billionaire. She wanted to make that clear, mostly to herself, at least twice a week since the engagement had been announced. She'd wanted a man who remembered how she took her coffee and noticed when she was tired before she said so, and it happened that the man who did both those things also happened to own 4 hotels, a private jet he rarely used, and a boardroom's worth of enemies who assumed she was after his money. She'd grown used to the assumption. She'd grown less used to the nights he disappeared into meetings that ran until midnight, into a version of himself she only saw the edges of. She was 30 years old, a pediatric physiotherapist with calloused hands and a laugh that came easily, and she had met Nathaniel Cole in the least romantic circumstance imaginable. His goddaughter had broken her wrist falling off a climbing frame, and Isla had been the therapist assigned to rebuild the girl's confidence in her own hands. Nathaniel had shown up to every single appointment for 3 months, not because anyone required it of him, but because, as he told Isla much later, over a bottle of wine she'd been too surprised to actually drink, he had wanted to understand what patience looked like when nobody was watching to reward it. She'd fallen for him slowly, against every instinct she had about men who arrived in expensive cars. What she hadn't expected was how ordinary he became once you got past the cars and the cover stories, how he still bit his nails when he was nervous, how he called his mother every Sunday without fail, how he'd once cried, actually cried, at the end of a film about a dog because the dog reminded him of one he'd had as a boy and lost too young. She loved that version of him. She was less certain, some nights, that the version of him currently overseeing a hotel group's expansion into 2 new continents had any room left for the man who used to sit through physiotherapy appointments just to learn what patience looked like. Friday night, 3 days after Nathaniel's accidental discovery in the back seat of a borrowed hatchback, Isla sat across from her older sister, Priya, no relation to Nathaniel's assistant despite the coincidence of the name, sharing a bottle of wine at the sister's kitchen table. Marisol, Isla actually called her, had married young and settled early, and had opinions about Isla's engagement that she rarely kept to herself. "You've barely mentioned the wedding in weeks," Marisol said, refilling both glasses without asking. "Last I heard you 2 were fighting about caterers. Now you're not even fighting. That's worse." "We're not fighting," Isla said. "He's in Geneva." "He's always somewhere," Marisol said, not unkindly. "That's not a criticism of him specifically, it's a criticism of the whole species of man he belongs to. They build empires and call it love because they don't know the difference between being needed and being present." Isla turned her wine glass slowly by the stem, watching the liquid climb the sides and settle. "He's different when we're actually together. You've seen it. I have, Marisol admitted. I've also seen you rearrange your entire life around the gaps when he's not. It wasn't an unfair point, and Isla hated that it wasn't. She thought about the ring on her finger, simple and understated by design, because she told Nathaniel early on that she didn't want a stone so large it announced itself before she did. She thought about the wedding date they'd set for the spring, still 6 months out, and the venue they hadn't finished arguing about, and the strange hollow feeling she got sometimes at 2 in the morning when his side of the bed had been empty for 3 nights running, and she found herself wondering, in the specific unglamorous way engaged people sometimes do, whether she actually knew the whole of the man she'd agreed to marry, or only the parts of him that showed up for appointments. She hadn't told Marisol about the late-night worry, the small itch of doubt she couldn't quite name, because naming it felt like giving it permission to grow. Instead she changed the subject, asked about her niece's school play, let the evening soften into something easier. But the itch didn't leave with the change of subject. It followed her home, into an apartment 2 blocks from the wine bar where, unbeknownst to her, Vanessa Marchetti had climbed into a car 3 nights earlier and set an entire chain of consequences into motion. Isla's phone buzzed as she was getting ready for bed. A message from Nathaniel, home Sunday night. Need to talk. Nothing bad, I promise, just important. Save me the evening. She read it twice. Nothing bad, I promise. The kind of sentence that only ever preceded something bad, or something enormous, and she wasn't sure yet which possibility frightened her more. She typed back a simple okay, then sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, phone in her lap, feeling the shape of Sunday loom ahead of her like weather she couldn't see clearly enough to prepare for. She didn't know that on the other end of that text, in a hotel room in a city he'd actually flown to only to buy himself distance and thinking room, Nathaniel Cole was staring at his own reflection in a dark window, rehearsing 4 different versions of a confession, and finding every single one of them inadequate to the size of what he'd done. Sunday arrived the way dreaded things always do, too slowly and then all at once. Nathaniel spent the morning in his penthouse rehearsing sentences in front of a mirror he hadn't looked into properly in weeks, and hating every version of himself that stared back. By noon he had a plan that felt less like a plan and more like a controlled demolition. He would meet Vanessa first, alone, at the flat, end things in language too clear to misinterpret, and secure whatever proof he could that she intended to extort him after the wedding. Then, before the sun set, he would sit across from Isla and tell her everything, not curated, not softened, everything, and let her decide what she wanted to do with a man who had let a lie live in his own building for 18 months. The flat smelled like her perfume when he let himself in at 2 o'clock, something floral and expensive that had once seemed thrilling and now made his stomach turn. Vanessa was curled on the sofa in a silk robe, scrolling through her phone, entirely unbothered by his arrival, as though she'd been expecting him precisely on schedule, which, he realized with a fresh wave of unease, she probably had. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "I like early. Early means nervous." Vanessa. He stayed standing near the door, deliberately, a physical boundary he needed as much as she did. "I know what you're planning. I heard you. 3 nights ago, in the back of a car." That got her attention. She set the phone down slowly, and for the first time since he'd known her, something like genuine surprise crossed her face before she smoothed it back into composure. "The Uber driver," she said, working it out in real time, her eyes narrowing. "That was you." "That was me." He kept his voice level, the same tone he used to deliver bad news to shareholders, calm because the alternative was chaos he couldn't afford. "I heard the whole call. The lawyer. The plan for after the wedding. I heard all of it, Vanessa." She didn't crumble the way he half expected, half wanted her to, if only because a crumbling woman would have been easier to feel sorry for and easier to walk away from cleanly. Instead she stood, robe falling open at the knee, and crossed the room toward him with the unhurried confidence of someone who still believed she held every card in the deck. "So you know," she said. "Good. Saves us both time. Here's what happens now. You marry your physiotherapist, you smile for the cameras, and you keep paying for this flat and everything in it, quietly, indefinitely, and I keep your secret. Or I make a call to a very well-connected friend at a tabloid, and Isla Bennett finds out exactly what her fiancé was doing 2 floors below his own penthouse for the last year and a half, right before her wedding, in the most public and humiliating way possible. That's blackmail. That's math, Vanessa said. You're a man who understands math better than anyone I've ever met. Do it. Nathaniel felt something in his chest go very still and very cold, the particular clarity that arrived, he'd noticed over the years, only in moments when there was truly nothing left to lose by telling the complete truth. No, he said. Vanessa blinked. No. I'm not paying you to keep a secret I'm about to tell myself. He reached into his jacket and set his phone on the counter, screen up, a voice memo app open and visibly recording, time-stamped from the moment he'd walked through the door. I've had this running since I got here. Every word. The demand, the threat, the lawyer, all of it. I'm not scared of what you know about me anymore, Vanessa, because in about 3 hours, there won't be anything left for you to threaten me with. I'm telling Isla myself. Tonight. All of it. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered across Vanessa's face, the calculations behind her eyes visibly scrambling to account for a variable she hadn't priced in. You'll lose her, she said, quieter now, almost gentle, as if she were doing him a kindness by warning him. You know that. No woman forgives this. Maybe not, Nathaniel said, and the honesty of it hurt more than he expected, a clean, sharp pain instead of the dull guilt he'd been carrying for weeks. But she deserves the chance to decide that for herself, with the truth in front of her, instead of a version I've spent 18 months managing for both of us. I should have ended this with you the day I met her. I didn't, because it was easier not to, and because some part of me liked having a door I could walk through when the rest of my life felt like too much responsibility. That's not your fault. That's mine. But it ends today, and it ends without you deciding the terms. He picked the phone back up, pocketed it, and looked around the flat one final time, at the rented furniture and the borrowed intimacy and the 18 months of a man he no longer wanted to be. The lease ends this month, he said. I'll have someone from the office handle the details. Don't contact Isla. Don't contact anyone connected to the wedding. If you do, that recording goes somewhere it will hurt you far more than it hurts me, because I have 4 hotels worth of lawyers and you have a phone full of receipts for a scheme you just confessed to on tape. He walked out without waiting for her answer, down the stairs instead of the elevator, needing the motion, needing his own legs under him doing something honest and physical while the rest of him caught up to what he'd just done. It was 2:40 in the afternoon. He had until evening to figure out how to tell the only good thing in his life that he had nearly let it burn down around her without ever telling her the fire existed. Isla opened her door at 7 that evening to find Nathaniel standing on her step without flowers, without his usual easy smile, without any of the small performances he normally arrived with. He looked, she thought immediately, like a man who had been awake for several days even though she knew he hadn't. There was something stripped down about him, some layer of polish gone missing, and her stomach dropped before he'd said a single word. You said nothing bad, she said, only half joking, stepping back to let him in. I lied, Nathaniel said. I'm sorry. It's bad. I need you to sit down, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if you stop me partway through I don't know if I'll have the nerve to get to the end. She sat. She didn't argue, though every instinct in her wanted to fill the silence with a joke, the way she always did when a room got too heavy to breathe in comfortably. She folded her hands in her lap and watched him pace once, twice, in front of her window, and waited. He told her all of it. Not the curated version, not the version that made him look like a man who'd stumbled into a mistake and corrected it quickly and cleanly. The real version. The flat 2 floors below his own penthouse. Vanessa's name, spoken aloud in Isla's living room for the first time, ugly in a way that names shouldn't be able to be. 18 months, on and off, of a relationship he told himself was already over more times than he could count and had never actually ended, not properly, not until 3 hours ago. The night he'd disguised himself as an Uber driver to test her, Isla, for a suspicion Priya had raised, a suspicion that had turned out to be nothing, an innocent night with her sister he'd twisted into evidence because some part of him had needed her to be the guilty one instead of himself. And then, cruelly, the accident of Vanessa climbing into his car instead, and the conversation he'd overheard, and the blackmail attempt, and the recording, and the ending of the lease that afternoon. He told her everything, in order, without softening a single detail, and when he finished, the silence in the room was the loudest thing Isla had ever heard. "Say something," he said finally, when he couldn't stand it anymore. Isla stood up. Her hands were shaking, she noticed, distantly, as though they belonged to someone else. "You spied on me," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to, betrayal doing strange things to volume. "You thought I was cheating, so you dressed up and drove around the city like some kind of, I don't even know what to call it, and instead of just asking me like a person who trusts the woman he's marrying, you built a whole operation to catch me in a lie I never told." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I know how it sounds. And in the middle of spying on me, you found out you'd been cheating on me for a year and a half." Isla laughed, one sharp, disbelieving sound with nothing funny in it. "That's not even the part that hurts most, and I need you to understand that, because the affair is its own wound, but the thing sitting on my chest right now is that you didn't trust me enough to ask a question out loud. You'd rather have driven strangers around the city at midnight than have one honest conversation with the person you're supposed to be building a life with." Nathaniel didn't defend himself. He'd promised himself in the car on the way over that he wouldn't, that the only decent thing left to offer her was the truth without armor around it, and so he stood there and let every word land exactly as hard as she needed it to. "I need you to leave," Isla said, and her voice cracked on the last word despite every effort to keep it steady. "Not forever. I don't know what forever looks like right now. But tonight, I need you to leave, because if you stay in this room another minute I am going to say something I can't take back, and I would rather sit alone with this than do that to both of us." He nodded. He didn't argue, didn't reach for her, didn't do any of the things a lesser version of himself might have tried in a bid to soften the exit. At the door he paused, hand on the frame, and looked back at her one more time. "I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me eventually. I just needed you to hear it from me, all of it, before it came from anyone else. Whatever you decide it with the truth in your hands instead of a version of me I built to keep you comfortable. That's the least you were owed, and it's 18 months late, and I'm sorry." He left. Isla stood in the middle of her living room long after the door clicked shut, staring at the space where he'd been standing, and cried the kind of tears that come from somewhere deeper than sadness, somewhere closer to the particular grief of losing a version of your own future you'd already started quietly building a life around. Outside, Nathaniel sat in his car in the dark for over an hour before he trusted himself to drive, replaying every sentence, wondering if he had just watched the best thing in his life walk out of reach for good, and understanding, with a clarity that felt like punishment, that if it had, he would have earned every bit of the losing. The weeks that followed didn't move like weeks so much as they crawled, each day dragging the next behind it. Isla returned the ring by courier, not out of cruelty but because she couldn't look at it on her dresser every morning without her chest tightening, and Nathaniel accepted the small velvet box back without a word of protest, understanding it for what it was, not an ending exactly, but a full stop she needed to place somewhere she could see it. He didn't chase her. That was the part that surprised his friends most, the ones who knew even a fraction of the story, because the Nathaniel Cole they'd built businesses alongside was a man who pursued what he wanted with a relentlessness that had made him rich and occasionally insufferable. But he'd promised himself, in the dark of that first night in his car, that he wouldn't turn his own remorse into another form of pressure on her. She had asked for space, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he gave someone exactly what they asked for instead of what he thought would fix things fastest. He cancelled the Geneva expansion for a quarter, not because the business needed him to, but because he needed, urgently, to remember what it felt like to build something slowly and honestly instead of acquiring it. He spent 3 days a week volunteering at the same children's clinic where Isla worked, not to see her, though he knew the odds, and not to perform contrition where she might witness it, but because somewhere in the wreckage of the last month he remembered that the version of himself she'd fallen for was the one who sat through months of physiotherapy appointments for a goddaughter with a broken wrist, and he wanted, badly, to find that man again on his own terms, whether or not it ever earned him anything with her. Isla, for her part, did not spend those weeks waiting. She threw herself into work with a focus that alarmed even Marisol, took on extra clinic hours, started running again in the mornings before dawn, the way she used to before Nathaniel's schedule had reshaped the contours of her own days without either of them fully noticing. She cried less by the third week, which she told herself was healing and privately worried was numbness instead. She didn't delete his number. She told herself that was practicality, unfinished logistics from a cancelled wedding, and not, absolutely not, because some stubborn corner of her heart still checked her phone at odd hours out of habit. The story broke in the second week regardless, despite Vanessa's silence, because these things always find their way into daylight eventually, though not in the way Nathaniel had feared. A junior employee at the leasing company handling the flat's termination mentioned it to a friend who mentioned it to someone with a blog, and by the time the item ran, small and speculative, buried in a gossip column rather than splashed across a front page, most of the real damage had already been done privately, in Isla's living room, weeks earlier. The public version barely registered. Isla read it once, felt nothing new, and closed the tab. What surprised her, in the strange arithmetic of heartbreak, was that the affair itself, ugly as it was, had stopped being the loudest thing in her chest by the fourth week. What she kept circling back to, at 2 a.m, at red lights, in the quiet moments between patients, was the image of him behind the wheel of a car that wasn't his, in a hat that wasn't his, driving through the city because he hadn't trusted her enough to simply ask if something was wrong. She understood, with the particular clarity distance sometimes grants, that the affair had been awound from before she'd even known to guard against it. But the surveillance, the disguise, the assumption of guilt before a single question had been asked out loud, that had happened to her, specifically, deliberately, by a man who was supposed to know better than anyone that she'd never once given him a reason not to trust her. She called Marisol on a Tuesday night, 4.5 weeks after the ring went back in its box, and said the thing she'd been circling for a month without quite landing on it. "I think I could forgive the other woman," she said, staring at her ceiling, phone pressed to her ear. "People are people, they make terrible choices, they get lonely, they get stupid. What I don't know if I can forgive is that instead of trusting me, he decided to catch me. That's not about her at all, Elle. That's about whether he ever actually saw me clearly." Marisol was quiet for a long moment. "Has he asked you to forgive him?" she said finally. "No," Isla admitted. "That's the strange part. He hasn't asked me for anything at all." "Maybe," Marisol said carefully, "that's worth paying attention to." Isla didn't answer right away. Outside her window, the city hummed its usual indifferent hum, unaware that somewhere in it a man was quietly rebuilding himself into someone worth trusting, without any guarantee that the woman he was rebuilding for would ever be close enough to notice. 6 weeks after the ring went back in its box, Isla found herself standing outside the children's clinic at closing time, keys in hand, staring at a man crouched on the pavement fixing a bicycle chain for one of her young patients, a 7-year-old named Oscar who came to the clinic twice a week for a hip condition that made ordinary things, walking, running, riding a bike, into small daily victories. She hadn't known Nathaniel had been volunteering there. Nobody had told her, deliberately, because the staff who did know had quietly decided, without discussing it aloud, that whatever was happening between the clinic's most dedicated new volunteer and its most respected physiotherapist wasn't theirs to interfere with. Isla stood frozen by the door, watching him work grease into his fingers without complaint, laughing at something Oscar said, patient in a way that had nothing to do with cameras or press releases or anyone watching who mattered to his public image. Oscar spotted her first. "Miss Isla. Nathaniel fixed my chain." Nathaniel looked up, and for a moment something raw and unguarded crossed his face before he could smooth it into anything more careful. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket, and didn't move toward her, didn't crowd the moment with anything more than his presence. I didn't know you volunteered here, Isla said, because it was the only sentence available to her that didn't require more honesty than she was ready to offer on a pavement in front of a 7-year-old. 3 days a week, the last month, Nathaniel said. I asked them not to mention it to you. I didn't want it to feel like a performance for your benefit. I needed it to be real, whether or not you ever knew about it. Oscar, sensing adult tension the way children always do, mumbled something about needing to find his mum and pedaled off toward the parking lot on his newly repaired bicycle, leaving the two of them alone in the fading afternoon light. Why are you really here, Nathaniel? Isla asked, arms crossed, though the posture felt more like self-protection than accusation. He considered the question longer than she expected. Because 6 years ago, before any of this, before the hotels made me someone people wanted things from, I used to volunteer at a clinic like this one back home. I stopped when the business got big enough to swallow all my time, and I told myself that was just what success cost. I've spent the last 6 weeks trying to figure out which parts of the man you fell in love with were real and which parts I'd let erode without noticing, and this was the first place I thought to start looking. That's not an answer to my question, Isla said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. No, he agreed. The honest answer is that I miss you in a way that doesn't fit inside a sentence, and I didn't trust myself not to make that your problem to manage. So I decided to become someone worth trusting first, and let you find that out on your own time, if you ever wanted to. I wasn't going to tell you I was here. You weren't supposed to see this. Isla looked at him for a long moment, at the grease still on his knuckles, at the absence of any driver, any assistant, any of the usual armor of his other life. I've been running every morning, she said finally, apropos of nothing, the way people sometimes offer information sideways when the direct version feels too dangerous to say straight on. Before dawn. I used to do it before you, and I stopped when we got together, and I only just realized a few weeks ago that I don't actually know when that happened, or why I let it. I know, Nathaniel said quietly. I've seen you. I run the same route most mornings, further back, because I didn't want you to think I was watching you again. Something in Isla's chest cracked slightly at that, not with anger this time, but with a complicated, aching tenderness she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. You're still watching me, she said, but there was no bite in it now. I'm trying to earn the right to be watched back, Nathaniel said. That's different. I know it doesn't erase what I did. I know 6 weeks of grease under my fingernails at a children's clinic doesn't undo 18 months of a lie I let live 2 floors under my own home. I'm not here to convince you of anything, Isla. I'm here because this is who I want to be whether or not you ever forgive me, and some part of me hoped that if I kept showing up as him, honestly, without an angle, you might eventually let yourself believe it. The parking lot had emptied around them. Somewhere behind the building, a child laughed at something, bright and unbothered by the weight sitting between the 2 adults on the pavement. I'm not ready, Isla said, finally, and it was the truest sentence she'd managed in 6 weeks. But I'm not asking you to stop coming here either. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to forgiveness. But it was, they both understood without saying so, a door left open a fraction of an inch wider than it had been that morning, and for the first time since the confession, Nathaniel let himself believe that might eventually be enough. It took 4 more months for the door to open the rest of the way, and it happened not in a grand gesture but in the accumulation of small, unglamorous consistencies, the kind that don't make it into gossip columns because they aren't dramatic enough to photograph. Nathaniel kept showing up at the clinic. He kept running the same early morning route, always a respectful distance behind her, never once closing the gap unless she slowed down first, which, gradually, over weeks that turned into a month and then 2, she began to do more often than not. They didn't discuss the wedding, which had long since been quietly cancelled, the deposits forfeited without complaint on either side. They didn't discuss Vanessa, who had, according to a brief item Isla saw once and didn't investigate further, moved to another city entirely, whatever leverage she'd once believed she held evidently worth less than the recording sitting somewhere in Nathaniel's lawyer's files. What they did instead, slowly, cautiously, was rebuild something smaller than what they'd had before, a friendship first, careful and deliberate, coffee some Sunday mornings after their respective runs, conversations that stayed in safer territory for a long time before either of them trusted the other enough to wander back toward anything resembling the future. The turn, when it came, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, not a rooftop, not a grand declaration, just Isla sitting across from Nathaniel in a diner booth near the clinic, the kind of unremarkable place with vinyl seats and a jukebox nobody used, not unlike the one he'd sat alone in the night everything had first started to unravel, though she didn't know that particular detail and he didn't offer it. "I looked you up," Isla said, stirring sugar into coffee she didn't actually want, mostly for something to do with her hands. "The old version of you. Before the hotels got big. There's an interview from years ago, some local paper, where you talk about wanting to build places that felt like home instead of just impressive. I don't know why I never read it before." "I'd forgotten I said that," Nathaniel admitted. "I hadn't," Isla said. "I think that's the man I actually fell for. And I think somewhere along the way, you convinced yourself that man wasn't enough anymore, that you had to become someone bigger, someone with backup plans and flats 2 floors under his own home, just in case the real version of yourself wasn't sufficient to hold on to what he had. I don't think you ever stopped loving me. I think you stopped trusting that loving me honestly would be enough." Nathaniel didn't argue with any of it, because there was nothing in the assessment he could honestly dispute. "I've spent 5 months trying to become someone who wouldn't need a backup plan," he said. "I don't know if I've succeeded. I know I haven't looked at another woman since the night I ended things with Vanessa, not because I'm performing restraint for your benefit, but because the person I actually want is sitting across from me right now, and she's the only future I've been building toward since. I know that's not proof. I know months of grease under my fingernails and early morning running isn't the same as 18 months of honesty I owed you and didn't give. But it's what I have, and it's real, and I'd rather offer you something real and imperfect than another performance that photographs well." Isla was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "I'm still angry sometimes," she said finally. "Not constantly. Not even often anymore. But sometimes, out of nowhere, it comes back, and I don't know what to do with it except let it pass through." "I'd rather have your anger," honestly offered, "than your silence," Nathaniel said. "I spent 18 months building a life around silence I told myself was kindness. I don't want that again, with you or with anyone. If you let me back in, even partway, I need you to promise me you'll say the hard things out loud, the way you did that night, instead of managing them quietly on your own. That's the only version of us I trust to actually last." Isla looked at him across the table, at the man who had once seemed made entirely of boardrooms and press releases and who now sat in a diner booth with grease permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, asking her not for forgiveness exactly, but for the harder, more durable thing underneath it. "Okay," she said finally, and the word carried more weight than either of them had expected a single syllable to hold. "Not the wedding. Not yet. But this. Us, figuring it out honestly, slowly, without pretending the last 6 months didn't happen." Nathaniel reached across the table, palm up, an offer rather than a demand, and after a long moment, Isla set her hand in his. It wasn't the rooftop proposal all over again. It wasn't a fairy tale reset erasing the damage as if it had never happened. It was something quieter and, in its own way, sturdier, 2 people choosing each other again with their eyes fully open this time, no disguises, no borrowed cars, no flats hidden 2 floors beneath the truth. 14 months after that diner conversation, Nathaniel proposed again, though the word proposed hardly captured what actually happened, since Isla had made him promise, months earlier, that whatever came next would never again feel like a performance staged for an audience. There was no rooftop this time, no photographer conveniently nearby, no ring hidden inside anything as poetic as a novel on a shelf. Instead there was a Sunday morning run, the same route they'd shared for over a year by then, and Nathaniel stopping halfway through, out of breath, laughing at his own nervousness, pulling a small box from the pocket of his running shorts because he hadn't trusted himself to wait until later in the day when his nerve might fail him entirely. "This isn't how I planned it," he admitted, kneeling on the pavement in running shoes, sweat still cooling on his skin, utterly unglamorous and, Isla would tell people later, exactly right because of it. You planned something? Isla asked, half laughing, half already crying, the two states blurring together the way they sometimes do at moments too large for a single emotion to hold alone. I planned 100 versions, Nathaniel said. Rooftops, gardens, one deeply embarrassing idea involving a hot air balloon that Priya talked me out of. Every single one of them felt like exactly the kind of grand gesture I used to hide behind instead of just telling you the truth. So I decided the only honest way to do this was to ask you exactly where we actually live our lives, halfway through a run, out of breath, no cameras, no rooftop, just you and me and the truth of who we've actually become to each other over the last year and a half. Isla was fully crying now, unbothered by the joggers who slowed slightly to watch, unbothered by anything except the man kneeling in front of her with a small, simple ring that looked nothing like the one she'd returned by courier over a year earlier. This one was smaller, plainer, chosen, he told her later, specifically because it didn't need to announce anything to anyone. It only needed to mean something to the two of them. Yes, Isla said, before he'd even finished the question, and Nathaniel laughed, relief and joy tangled together as he slid the ring onto her finger with hands that were shaking despite months of preparing for this exact moment. They married the following spring, a smaller wedding than the one originally planned, 40 guests instead of 400, held in the garden of the children's clinic where they'd both, in their separate ways, found their way back to who they actually wanted to be. Oscar, older now and walking without the hitch that had first brought Isla into his life, served as ring-bearer, taking the responsibility with a gravity that made half the guests laugh through their tears. Marisol gave a toast that mentioned, carefully and without naming specifics, that the truest love stories weren't the ones without any cracks in them, but the ones where two people chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to keep showing up honestly even after the cracks appeared. Nathaniel sold the hotel group's Geneva expansion rights within the year, not out of any dramatic renunciation of ambition, but because he'd realized, slowly, over the 18 months of rebuilding trust one honest morning at a time, that he no longer needed the empire to prove anything to himself, or to anyone else. He kept the 4 original hotels, the ones built before success had convinced him he needed exceptions. He opened a 5th, smaller than the others, in the neighborhood where the children's clinic sat, and named the ground floor community space after Oscar's grandmother, who had spent decades running youth programs in the area before her retirement. Isla kept working at the clinic, promoted eventually to lead the pediatric rehabilitation program, though she never let the promotion change the parts of the job she loved most, the actual hands-on work with kids like Oscar, teaching small bodies to trust themselves again after injury the way she'd had to relearn how to trust a much larger, more complicated kind of healing in her own life. They didn't talk about Vanessa again, not because the wound had disappeared entirely, but because it had finally, genuinely, stopped being the loudest thing in the room. What replaced it, slowly, patiently, morning run by morning run, honest conversation by honest conversation, was something neither of them had fully trusted was possible in the weeks after that first terrible confession, a love built not on disguises or backup plans or flats hidden 2 floors beneath the truth, but on the plain, unglamorous, daily choice to keep showing up as exactly who they actually were. 2 years after the wedding, on a warm evening in early autumn, Nathaniel stood in the doorway of a nursery he'd painted himself over a single weekend, refusing every offer of professional help because he'd wanted, this time, to build something for his family with his own hands rather than paying someone else to do it for him. Isla sat in the rocking chair by the window, 7 months pregnant, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, watching him fumble with the mobile he was trying to hang above the crib, a small constellation of paper stars he'd insisted on making himself despite 3 failed attempts the previous evening. "You know you could have just bought one," she said, laughing as he swore quietly at a piece of fishing line that refused to cooperate. "I know," Nathaniel said, not looking up from his work. "I wanted to make this one instead." It had become something of a pattern between them, in the 2 years since the wedding, this quiet insistence on building things by hand instead of buying the polished, effortless version available to a man of his resources. He'd built the bookshelf in the nursery himself too, smaller than the one in their bedroom but cut from the same reclaimed oak, a callback neither of them needed to explain out loud anymore. Isla had filled it slowly over the months of her pregnancy with the books she wanted their daughter to grow up surrounded by, some her own childhood favorites, a few new ones she and Nathaniel had picked out together on quiet Sunday afternoons, no longer strangers to the specific ordinary pleasure of building a life in small increments instead of grand gestures. The star finally hung correctly, catching the last of the evening light through the window, and Nathaniel stepped back to admire his admittedly imperfect handiwork before crossing the room to kneel beside Isla's chair, resting his hand over hers on the curve of her belly. "Do you ever think about that night?" Isla asked, quieter now, the teasing gone from her voice. "The one where you drove around the city pretending to be someone else." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same care he gave every serious thing she asked him now, a habit built slowly over 2 years of choosing honesty even when it cost him something. "Every so often," he admitted. "Usually when I catch myself starting to hide something small and harmless, a headache I don't mention because I don't want you to worry, a bad day at work I try to smooth over instead of just saying it was hard. It reminds me how quickly small hidden things become large ones if you let them sit long enough in the dark." "And what do you do, when you catch yourself?" "I tell you," Nathaniel said simply. "Even the small things. Especially the small things. I promised myself, after everything, that I'd rather annoy you with too much honesty than protect you with any amount of a lie, even a well-intentioned one. It's not always easy. Some old habits don't fully disappear, they just get quieter, and you have to keep choosing not to listen to them." Isla laced her fingers through his, resting both their joined hands against the movement of the baby shifting beneath her palm. "I used to think forgiving you was going to be the hard part," she said. "It turned out the hard part was learning to trust that the change would hold, day after day, long after the drama of it faded into something ordinary. But it has. 2 years of ordinary Tuesdays, and you've shown up honest on every single one of them, even the ones where honesty cost you something. That's what actually convinced me, in the end. Not the proposal, not the wedding, just all those unremarkable Tuesdays adding up into something I could finally trust." Nathaniel pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then to the curve of her belly, murmuring something too quiet for Isla to fully catch, a private promise meant for a daughter who wouldn't arrive for another 2 months but who was already, in every way that mattered, the reason he intended to keep choosing honesty for the rest of his life, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Downstairs, the doorbell rang, Marisol arriving early for dinner with a bottle of wine Isla wouldn't be drinking and a bag of hand-me-down baby clothes she'd been collecting for months despite Isla's repeated insistence that they had more than enough. Oscar, now 11 and taller than anyone expected, trailed in behind her carrying a hand-drawn card for the baby that read, in careful, determined lettering, "Welcome to the family, from your first friend." He'd insisted on delivering it in person rather than waiting for the baby shower, a small gesture that made Isla tear up in the particular easy way pregnancy had made her prone to lately. The house filled slowly with noise and warmth, the smell of the dinner Nathaniel had started before losing himself in the nursery mobile, the sound of Marisol's laughter carrying up the stairs, Oscar already deep in an argument with the family's new rescue dog about whose turn it was to sit on the good cushion. Isla stood in the nursery doorway for a moment longer, watching Nathaniel adjust the paper stars one final time, and thought, not for the first time, about the version of herself who had once stood in this same city, angry and heartbroken, certain that trust once broken could never be fully rebuilt. She had been wrong, she understood now, not because the breaking hadn't mattered, it had mattered enormously, had cost them both nearly a year of careful, deliberate work to repair, but because she had underestimated how sturdy something could become once it was rebuilt honestly, plank by plank, ordinary day by ordinary day, instead of papered over with the kind of easy forgiveness that never actually addresses what broke in the first place. Nathaniel turned from the crib and found her watching him from the doorway, and the smile that crossed his face held none of the practiced charm of the man who'd once stood in a doorway in gray joggers, all confidence and easy deflection. This smile was quieter, more certain, the smile of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it cost to lose something worth having, and exactly what it took, every single day afterward, to keep it. "Ready for dinner?" he asked, crossing the room to take her hand. "Almost," Isla said, glancing once more at the small paper stars turning slowly above the empty crib, at the bookshelf waiting to be filled with a lifetime of stories for a daughter who hadn't arrived yet but was already, in every way that counted, wanted completely, honestly, without a single hidden room left anywhere in the house they'd built together. They walked downstairs together, into the noise and the warmth and the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesdayness of a life fully, finally, chosen in the open. If this story moved you, take a moment to leave a comment and let us know which part hit hardest, the confession in the diner, the early morning runs, or the paper stars over an empty crib. Share it with someone who believes trust can be rebuilt, plank by plank, if two people choose it honestly, every ordinary day. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story about love that survives the truth instead of hiding from it. Thank you for staying with Nathaniel and Isla until the very last page of their story, from the first suspicious ping of that late-night ride to the paper stars turning slowly above an empty crib. There are so many more stories like this one waiting for you, each about the quiet, unglamorous work of choosing honesty long after the easy part of falling in love has passed, and about how the truest kind of love is rarely the one that never breaks, but the one two people keep choosing to repair, together, one ordinary day at a time.